And I think by some estimates, the popul in the 20th century, the population went from a couple billion to like now over, well, about 6 billion, I think, by the turn of the 2000 or so. And I think a lot of that is attributed directly to the Haber-Bosch process because that's one of the bottlenecks for human population growth is how much nitrogen we can get because nitrogen is a direct input into food production. Absolutely. You have to have nitrogen input into the soil. And once you start putting more nitrogen in the soil, you can increase your yield by huge percentages. And so um, that's a bottleneck. And then once you figure that out and you have an industrial scale way of just pumping nitrogen back into the earth, you have a lot more plants that grow faster, they grow more lush. You can feed more people with plants, or you can use those plants directly to feed a livestock or other food that can be grown as well. So, absolutely crucial process for life on Earth, and it's it's not something that I mean I think we just take a lot of things for granted, but you know there's a lot of different technologies, that one in particular, and a lot of other ones that have directly contributed to the standard of living that we enjoy today, and also the amount of people there are on this planet. So, um, good book. Next, On Writing by Stephen King. This is I haven't read a lot of books on writing specifically, but I will say that this was a highly recommended book. I read a lot of reviews about it that was saying this is one of the better, or if not the best book you can read on writing, and it was great. It's a great book. Stephen King is an absolutely great writer. He has a very natural style that it just flows. It's easy to read and it's very casual. He's not too wordy, but he's also clever. It's a kind of a very difficult combination to get right and do well. And I think he does it well. But he goes into how he thinks about writing and what works and what doesn't. And he also goes into his upbringing and a lot of his history and where he came from. And he was kind of a lower and later kind of middle class working guy from Maine, and he just worked very hard for a long time, and he's very dedicated to the craft. And he was very regimented and very scheduled, and he'd get up kind of around the same time every day. He would just write straight for 3 to 4 hours and take a break, and he'd just do that every day. And he turned it into turned it into a habit, and he turned it into a discipline. And that's really what you have to do with these things. So that was really, I wouldn't say eye opening, because it's like you kind of intuitively already know that that's the kind of stuff it takes. It takes some grit, it takes some guts, and it takes some dedication. But hearing one of the great authors and someone as prolific as him just go into like, there's nothing really glamorous about it. There's nothing really special about it. I'm just a regular guy who just worked hard and doing what I love. And, I sit down and I tell the story. I don't try and get too over crazy with all these weird things and too literary. It's like you just tell the effing story, and you work hard at it, and nothing's given. And it's like it's not glamorous. He's like the where I sat down to write, it's ugly. It's not really. There's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing pretty about it. Um, and so that's cool, and it's actually inspiring in a weird way. It was inspiring to read his perspective about it, and also get some pointers with how to become a better writer. The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, what can you really say about The Hobbit? It's just I've read it twice actually. It's just a thoroughly entertaining fantasy book, and obviously it's inspired pretty much probably every fantasy book to follow, and probably a lot of science fiction, and probably just a lot of literature in general. It's just a really readable, super fun book, um, and very imaginative. I think Tolkien just he came up with a whole bunch of new elements and fantasy ideas and tropes that had never been done before. So I think in a way it was a revolutionary book. Um, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, Weston A. Price. This is, if you're into nutrition and you're into, yeah, if you're into nutrition and maybe even a little bit of like of the conspiracy side of things, this is a good book. This is basically Weston A. Price was a dentist. I think he was back in the 1930s, and he just kind of had a scientific mind. Like he had all these clients come in, clients, not clients, patients. He had patients come in who had cavities, and he was just this was before I think a lot of the theory about germs really became a big thing, and plaque and all that. I think it was before they really understood the cause of maybe they had a pretty good idea, but nonetheless, he had a lot of patients coming in who had cavities, and so he's trying to figure out like why do they have cavities, and so um, one of the things he surmised was that it had something to do with diet. So what he did is him and his wife just decided they would travel around the world and just document um, and compare and contrast different tribes and groups of people, both traditional societies and modern societies, and just compare them and see is there any type of diet that is better to mitigate cavities, or is there other diets that actually promote their formation? What he found was it's absolutely true. So yeah, big surprise. We all know that now. We all know that sugar and different types of foods that are high in carbohydrates can cause a formation of bacteria-inducing or plaque-inducing bacteria. But um, what he found was that there was tribes, there's groups of people that had been untouched by the standard American diet or standard Western diet, and they didn't have any cavity. They didn't brush their teeth at all, but they didn't have any cavities, or if they did, they were very, very rare. But not only that, they had perfect teeth, and they never needed braces, and there was nothing crooked. The other thing is, they didn't need to have their wisdom teeth removed, so they had no crowding. So what was really crazy is that they all had fully developed jaw bones. So their jaws were really fully developed, their face structure was fully developed, they had no teeth crowding, and all their teeth were perfectly straight, and they had no cavities. And they were eating tons and tons of seafood, meat, fat, like high fat diet, bone broth. They were eating, like in Switzerland, there was an old school or a kind of traditional group of people that lived up in the mountains that didn't have, considered like a standard Western diet. And they were eating a high amount of fresh grass fed butter. So they would have these cows up there, and that would eat really fresh grass. They would make butter out of that right away. And they just had this really rich raw butter. And they were eating that all the time. Then they were eating goat, and they were eating cow. And then they would take all the leftover parts of the cow, they make a stew out of it. And so they made really rich broths, and they eat the organ meats. So a lot of these societies ate a lot of organ meats, a lot of seafood, clams, shellfish. And that was like a main staple of a lot of these diets. That was the big thing they had in common. And what they didn't eat, obviously, was sweets, carbs. And if they had any carbs, it was almost always fermented. They would ferment grains, but that wasn't usually the mainstay of their diet. So a lot of raw dairy, a lot of meat, a lot of high quality animal fats. And he inferred from all of his research that there was a particular fat soluble vitamin that was in all these foods that was extremely beneficial for um, proper bone structure, calcium deposition, and just normal growth, and also the mitigation of disease and cavities. And and he called it Activator X in the book. And now I'm pretty sure most nutritionists or people who studied um, what what he researched back then conclude that it's vitamin K2. Um, and I know vitamin K2 is pretty well known now, but it's just more recently, I think within the last 10, 15 years, that it's nutritionists and scientists have realized how important it is for proper movement or deposition of calcium and bone density. And I'm pretty sure it works in synergy with vitamin D, vitamin A, and calcium. I think those four things work together in synergy. Um, and so the last thing I want to say about this book is that he didn't just write about all this stuff. He actually took pictures. He took pictures of people in these tribes or in these groups of people, and he just showed how healthy they looked, and he showed how their teeth looked, and how you could see in the photos of some of these traditional tribes and groups of people, they have perfect teeth. They look extremely happy. They look extremely healthy. They're pretty shredded. They're all in good shape, and he even wanted to compare and contrast people who had been born into some of these traditional tribes and then went to a place where they had like a standard Western diet, or that was higher in carbs. And he compared and contrasted. He even found a couple of brothers, that were separated at birth. One grew up in the traditional society, and one grew up in in an area where they had like a standard Western diet that was higher in sugar and carbs and lower in the fat soluble vitamins and protein. And there was a clear difference, obviously. So the one who grew up in the standard Western diet, or Western diet with a lot of sugar, had a lot of like a narrow jawbone, crowding teeth, crooked teeth. Even their nose was more narrow. Their nasal passages was a little bit more narrow. So it looked like the fat soluble vitamins are actually crucial for your entire skeletal development, especially during adolescence when you go through those growth spurts. And so it even made me wonder that when I was younger, I mean, even still now, I don't have an optimum diet probably, but when I was younger and going through adolescence, I was eating just sandwiches, and I was eating just regular kind of Western food. And I think there was a fair amount of protein and decent fats, but maybe it wasn't quite optimized, or maybe it wasn't really good enough, and too high in carbs and other things that maybe are depleting of minerals. I had teeth crowding, and I had crooked teeth. My wisdom teeth had to get pulled out, and I ended up getting braces, and now my top teeth are good. And my bottom teeth are a little bit crooked, like over here, but they were all straight at one point. But nonetheless, I just wonder if I would have had an optimum diet all the way through my adolescence and childhood, all the necessary fat soluble vitamins on top of the normal nutrition I was getting from the food I was eating at the time, would I actually look a little bit different? Would my face be a little bit wider? Would I have a little bit more prominent? I mean, I already have a pretty sharp jawbone or square jaw, but would it be a little bit more prominent? Would my facial features be a little bit more spread out, a little bit wider, and my teeth would have filled in a little bit better? I mean, I don't know. But it definitely raises some interesting questions. And this book was cool because it helped me to look at nutrition and the history of nutrition and optimum nutrition in a different way. How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. I'm actually not quite done with this book yet. I'm getting there. I'm pretty close to being finished, and he's just making the case for the importance of psychedelics and the history. He goes in the history of psychedelics. I mean, I've been a advocate for psychedelics for a long time. I haven't taken anything for quite some time. I'm actually probably due. I know I'm due for a good session with the right thing. Psilocybin, ayahuasca, whatever it is. But I think I'm probably due for a good sit down for a few hours, because I've had an interesting year, to say the least. What else do we have? Da, 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 da. Siddhartha. I like Siddhartha. That's a cool book. Herman Hesse. Yeah, that's an interesting book. Gautama Siddhartha. Basically, everyone has their own path to enlightenment. Don't venerate me because I went through all this stuff and found enlightenment. Which it's a good message. It has a good message.